I wanted to briefly thank the organizers of this event. It's the first time that I participate. I'm very honored to be here. Special thanks to Professor Fallico, who reached out to me personally. On behalf of the World Economic Forum, I'd like also to send special greetings to Intesa, VTB, Visa, Accenture, SACE, that are all our members and partners. We've been working with them and enjoying a long collaboration with. Greetings also to the organizers of SPIEF that we have collaborated with for a long time as well. Obviously, all the representatives of the governments and institutions. What I'm going to try to do today is to share with you a competitive analysis of Russia and a few notes about Eurasian countries. The considerations that I'm making are based on a very extensive report that the World Economic Forum has been publishing for a very long time, I think almost 20 years, called the Global Competitiveness Report. The purpose of the report is to essentially assess the competitive landscape of 140 countries around the world, focusing in particular on the drivers of their productivity and prosperity. What makes this report really interesting, in my opinion, obviously I'm biased, is that because it provides an opportunity to identify strengths and weaknesses and track how countries evolve over time and rank, this report has helped and continues to help inform and support policymakers, businesses, and civil society in developing their long-term vision on how they want their countries to evolve and perform. The definition of competitiveness that we use is essentially based on the identification of a set of institutions, of policies and factors that determine the level of productivity of an economy, which obviously informs and shapes the level of prosperity that countries can potentially achieve. I will try and go fast on the concept and in the rationale and the models that we use in the report, because I believe it's a bit less interesting, and try and spend more of my time on the specific case of Russia and a few notes on a few Eurasian countries. This report is basically compiled using a combination of hard data, IMF, World Bank, United Nations, World Health Organization, WTO, and so on. Plus, which is a proprietary and in my opinion, very unique, the results of an executive opinion survey that we conduct among 10,000 operators in the 140 countries that I mentioned, both from public sector, private sector, academia, and civil society, on essentially their opinions and perceptions on a number of key questions about the competitiveness of these countries. And in that sense, the report is based largely also on this perception survey, but I believe it makes it also quite interesting because all these decision makers use their understanding and their perception to inform their decisions, investment decisions, hiring decisions, spending decisions, and they turn into consequences on the GDP of these countries, obviously. So briefly, this report essentially builds the concept of competitiveness on 12 pillars, and I'll focus in particular on those that are particularly relevant for Russia and Eurasia. I think that the most important one is the one on institutions, meaning that the report uses the evaluation of how good property rights and the relevant protection are in a given country, efficiency, transparency of the public administration, corporate governance, independence of judiciary, and so on, which obviously are often an issue that is identified as far as Russia and Eurasian countries are concerned in terms of dragging their competitiveness down. Infrastructure, in particular the quality of transportation, electricity, telecommunication, Macroeconomic environment is also very important, fiscal, monetary, savings rates, sovereign levels of sovereign debt, and so on and so forth. I will quickly move to the findings of the report that actually has just been published, I think a couple of weeks ago, so that's quite fresh in a way. Like Professor Prodi mentioned before, like other contributors mentioned before, overall, the recovery from the global financial crisis has been relatively mild and more uncertain and slower than many would have expected, given the levels of stimuli, both monetary and fiscal, that happen in so many key countries. So the results of the competitiveness report seem to point at a new normal where essentially we should all get used to a lower level of economic growth, lower level of productivity growth, higher unemployment. On the other hand, enacting and implementing some of the measures that I will speak about in a moment that correspond to important structural reforms can actually counter this concept of a mediocre new normal. So it's particularly important that some of the countries that we're going to talk about pay the necessary attention to those. The historic proportions of the crisis and the relevant, as I said, mediocre performance of economies since its beginning shows, as I mentioned, a structural weakness that exacerbates the effects of the crisis, and hence the even bigger importance of these reforms that I'll mention after, in order to counter the mediocrity of economic growth that should be boosted by all the measures that have been developed over the last few years. Competitiveness, why is competitiveness important? Because it's significant in terms of the opportunity, the capability of economies and countries to better perform also in the context of crisis. This graph essentially indicates that the average growth rate of the best performing countries is very highly correlated to their degree of competitiveness. To many of you, that might sound obvious, but essentially it re-emphasizes the importance for an economy, in a country, to work on those factors that inform competitiveness, and quality of institutions is one that I will emphasize even more later on, in order to support its growth, even in a context where growth is very lukewarm. So there is an interesting, if you look at the first part of the graph to the left, a comparison of how United States, Switzerland, and Denmark, which are very competitive in economies as ranked in our report, importantly overperform the growth rates of Italy, Hungary, and Greece that rank significantly lower in the competitiveness report. Just for your information, we're always curious people. I think we economists are, I assume you also are. A quick snapshot of which are the 10 most competitive countries as ranked in our recent report. Switzerland, Singapore, United States are the 3 most competitive ones. Many of these are not surprising, but the one note that I want to make is that Scandinavian countries have significantly overperformed many others over the last few years for the quality of their institutions, whereas United States and Singapore in particular always perform well for their capability to innovate, to be very lively in innovation. So how do the countries that we are interested in, how did they perform in our ranking? As you see to the left, the BRICS countries perform relatively high, in particular China, Russia, South Africa. Remember that this is a ranking of 140 countries. To the right, you can see how all the countries that are members of the Commonwealth of Independent States have been performing. As you can see, there is a significant difference. The one consideration that I will make on Russia in particular is that, as you see, its performance in the ranking has been improving consistently over the last few years. There is an important caveat, which is that the IMF, and I will not bore you with these technicalities, but the IMF has revised their purchasing power parity estimates and their calculations. And in that sense, this has boosted the performance of Russia's GDP significantly. And the caveat, this is a caveat because maybe the improvement of the ranking of Russia that you see from 67 in 2012 to 45 is a little bit inflated. However, there are two elements that are important and explain why Russia has improved its competitiveness position. One is improvement in some market efficiency aspects, so in particular regulatory business environment and domestic competition that reflect the efforts of the government in those spaces, and the significant reduction of tariffs that has come with Russia joining the WTO a couple of years ago. So this is an important improvement over the years, but it's still 45th position. I want to focus the couple of minutes that I've left with in my contribution here on this slide and the following. The lessons for Russia's future economic development and the relevant recommendations. These are part of actually a study that has been commissioned by President Putin to the World Economic Forum, essentially asking us for a recipe. So what needs to be done? Obviously, this is easier than doing it, but at least having clarity on what are the key drivers of the key reforms that that are posited to improve the competitiveness of Russia are the following. The first one and most important one is improving institutions. And that would be the biggest driver of growth. One of the biggest problems of the Russian economy, you can see in the following slide that I'll elaborate a bit on, is, as you see, is corruption. This is the biggest drawback, the biggest issue that comes in the way of doing business in Russia is corruption. Followed by the difficulty to access financing for small and medium enterprises in particular, the complexity of tax regulations and inefficient government bureaucracy. So I'll come back to the slide before to, again, emphasize the recommendations that we produce for President Putin's attention. Improving institutions is the biggest one. Leveraging the performance of a few very positively performing regions, and they can play a big role in improving institution and laying the foundation for the rest of the country for a faster and more sustainable growth. So there are a few very positive examples in the Russian Federation of what needs to be done, and that has already been implemented. Business environment reforms significantly can increase the growth in Russian regions, and comprehensive rather than selective reform approaches. So in particular, the four key areas that we recommended to President Putin and the Russian government in this study were reducing corruption, improving access to finance, reducing red tape, so the weight of bureaucracy, and addressing the inadequate education of the workforce, so vocational training and other types of education. This is the complete list of the factors that need attention, but the most important ones I have covered. And then really to conclude with the last few seconds that I have available for my contribution here, and thanks for your attention, there are in particular, again, this is a comparison essentially, this is called a spider graph. The outer blue line corresponds to the performance of Russia, and the gray corresponds to the performance of other CIS countries. As you can see, Russia pretty consistently outperforms every other country of Eurasia. However, again, the big areas of improvement that need to happen are those that are the closest to the center of this graph. And again, they are the weakness of institution, the development and the depth of financial markets, innovation and the capability to innovate, business sophistication and diversification. Many other participants mentioned that the Russian economy needs to diversify further away from commodities and energy. And that was that. Thanks for your attention.